Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 11 in my Patreon exclusive series on sculpting a half-life size figure. Everything is where it needs to be on this figure at the moment, more or less, with the exception of the head, of course. I think we'll wait with the head and leave that for the very last episode. The cherry on top, if you will. So, with that in mind, today we will be rendering the surface of our sculpture. You'll see there's a lot more to rendering than just making a smooth surface. There's a lot of other considerations that I'll make during this process, and we'll talk about it right here. So, let's get to it. What you are watching right here on YouTube is an excerpt from the full 40-minute long video, which you can find by visiting my Patreon page, and there's a link for that in the description below. We'll start off with the more existential or philosophical reasons for spending an entire day rendering the surface. Could we not just leave it as it is right now, for example? Do we need to render the surface? Of course we could leave it as it is. There are pros and cons to rendering the surface of a sculpture. You can think of rendering as increasing the resolution of a video or a photograph. The higher the resolution, the more clear the image we are watching is. But when the image becomes clearer, more gets exposed as well. Good stuff gets exposed, but bad stuff gets exposed too. Imagine a high-resolution photograph of your nose. It would potentially, depending on your nose of course, have some unsightly visuals potentially. Decreasing the resolution might keep the image of the nose intact, but make sure none of these unsightly features stand out. Now it's the same deal in sculpture. By increasing the resolution, all your mistakes have the potential to stand out more than if you left the surface rough and unfinished. Of course, the opposite is true as well. A higher level of resolution will show off more of the work that you've done. For me, the potential outweighs the risk, and I almost always go for a fairly rendered surface over a very rough and unfinished one. The things that I find interesting about sculpture, shape design, forms, transitions, these things are not really present if you leave the surface unfinished and rough. If these are qualities of your sculpture that you'd like to emphasize, bring out, you need to render the clay surface of your sculpture. Early on here in the video, the shape design for the ribs, for example, is hardly clear and visible. It's very rough. But as I increase the resolution, the shapes become clearer, easier to see. This will of course expose me if I have poor shape design as well. We've spoken about it before, but you can never properly judge the work that you've done unless you push it forward and resolve your sculpture. The rougher block-in present at the beginning of this video, of this episode, cannot be judged harshly because whether it's right or wrong is super ambiguous. It's tough to tell exactly what is right and what is wrong with the sculpture. Increasing the resolution, resolving the sculpture, gives me the opportunity to see if the work I've done was right. From the perspective of wanting to create something lifelike, I think resolving the surface is useful as well, though potentially not necessary. A rougher finish leaves more up to the imagination, while a rendered surface leaves less up to the imagination and more up to the sculptor's hand. If we do a good job, it will be on display. The success of your sculpture is, if resolved, not leaning heavily or coming down to your clay application or anything that can be subjectively judged, how nice you smudged the eyes or something like that. I like to leave whether a piece is good or not up to me, not up to the viewer's discretion. You cannot stop people from not liking your work, of course, but you can potentially force them to recognize that the work is at least competent. Let's thank today's sponsors, my Patreon supporters on Patreon, who have ensured the continued existence of this channel and allowed me to upgrade my gear bit by bit, making better looking and better sounding content for all of you watching. If you are interested in supporting the channel, or perhaps interested in getting personal feedback on your sculptures from me, or watching more in-depth tutorials on sculpture, then Patreon is the place for you. You can get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you might need help with in your sculpting endeavors. If you prefer to learn visually, there's also my Patreon exclusive videos on there. The Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture, which will provide you with all the information you need in order to sculpt a half-life size, standing female figure. It's a deep dive into all the concepts I use to construct every sculpture that I make. So, check it out. There's a link to my Patreon page in the description below. So the reasons for rendering the surface of my sculpture is for me many. A rendered surface highlights the aspects of sculpture that I most enjoy looking at, most enjoy working on. With the goal of creating lifelike sculptures, I also enjoy creating a surface which visually reads like skin, kind of like a visual illusion, if you will. I attempt to create work that's lifelike in every aspect, the surface being one of them. A result surface also holds me highly accountable for all the decisions that I've made throughout the entire process, and I kind of like this. The keen-eyed amongst you might have noticed that as my tool goes over the clay surface, I'm not simply petting the clay and attempting to make it smooth. There's a lot more to it than that, a lot more going on. So let's cover some of it. I actually add clay as my tool moves over the sculpture, almost adding a layer of fresh clay on top of the old clay. Now, if we had 2 layers of clay and the clay was 2 different colors, you would have been able to see this very, very easily. Now, there are several reasons for adding clay like this. I don't want to simply pet the clay, as the goal is not to make the sculpture smaller or less volumetric, even if it's by a fraction of a millimeter, and adding a little clay ensures that, if anything, the volume of the sculpture, the space that it takes up, increases. At the same time, I'm careful not to add copious amounts. We're talking about millimeters here. Not something that is going to compromise or potentially heavily compromise work that's already been done. I'm also super careful about where I add clay. I never want to mess with my contours. That's the outline of the figure from the 4 views that we used to observe. And as a quick reminder, the 4 views are the front, the back, and the 2 sides, of course. I never want to grow or change these contours, and the only time I'll add or remove clay from them is if I'm consciously observing them and working on them. I'll never add clay that in any way, shape, or form move any of the volumes that I've placed also. I respect my own work. I respect the work that I've done previously, for the most part. I will continue to respect the borders of the forms that I've already set up. If one of them gets exposed as being misplaced, I'll deal with that, of course. But in general, I'm making sure none of them move around by accident. Everything needs to be done with purpose, on purpose. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did and want to learn sculpture from me or just support the channel, check out my Patreon page. Next time we work on this piece, we will sculpt a portrait, which is the last piece of the puzzle, and essentially the finishing of our sculpture will happen then. So stay tuned. Hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, click the like button and share with your friends and family. It helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching. Stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.